after.
Mencionó que iba a describir pues el proceso del
Yeah,
libro.
yeah. It's her, it's me, maybe then Wei, and then Mauricio. What do you prefer in terms of the order?
Doesn't matter.
I want to make sure that
I would think that
Maybe it's 1, 1, 1, 1. You know.
So, me, Ariel,
Wei,
Ray 老师, and then
Mauricio.
all right.
So you're now in London?
Yeah.
Can we turn on this?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session, co-sponsored with the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States and the Latin American program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program here. It's a pleasure to see many familiar faces and many faces that I don't recognize, always a good sign. Ariel and Julia, in writing the book that we'll be discussing today, called From the Great Wall to the New World, China and Latin America in the 21st Century, have reminded us that questions of political economy and defense strategy and bilateral relations have dominated the analysis of China's relationship with Latin America. And I would actually go even further and say that it's really the questions of political economy that have been front and center in most of the discussion. We know, according to CEPAL and to almost every other economic think tank, that China is the main driver of world trade. Chinese demand for commodities, food, energy, such as oil particularly, is the single most important factor in explaining the very impressive growth throughout South America in the first decade of the new millennium. At the same time, cheap exports of Chinese manufactured goods have cut into the market share of places such as Mexico and Central America. Chinese lending to the region, just to give a sense of the dimensions of it, exceeds that of the World Bank and the IMF. And CEPAL, the IDB here represented by our colleague Mauricio Mesquita Morera, have all taken the lead in exploring the trading relationship, the economic relationship, and what it implies for Latin American growth, competitiveness, and also the dangers of a renewed reliance on the export of primary commodities. But recent years have seen some important changes in that dynamic. Primary exports in places such as Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil have spurred technological innovation and modernization and have shown linkages to other sectors in the production chain. Chinese companies, long considered to be not considerate of the environment, in countries such as Peru, have become much more sensitive to the environmental and social impacts of their investments. Brazil, the economic giant of the region, has required Chinese companies in the manufacturing sector to build plants in Brazil, not just to export to the Brazilian market. The government has also pushed back to limit and shape the ways that Chinese companies are allowed to own land in Brazil. And yet, as Ariel and Julia have reminded us, there are a wide range of new interactions as the scholarship about China and Latin America has expanded and people have spent significant amounts of time as Latin Americanists living in China and speaking Chinese. Some of these other issues have to do with the transnational flows of people as well as capital, the fluidity of perceptions in China and in Latin America about one another, what the changing assumptions of China's top leadership mean for the Chinese-Latin American relationship. All of those issues are ones that they will discuss today. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to thank Stapleton Roy, Ambassador Roy, the director of the Kissinger Institute for China in the United States, Sandy Foh of the Kissinger Institute for their collaboration with us in this. Thank my staff members, especially Veronica Colon Rosario Adam Stubbits in helping to put this event together. And also, I would like to especially thank Julie Anderson, one of our hardworking interns who is spending her last day with us today. So you have the bio, so I'd really only like to do a brief introduction of our speakers. We'll start with Julia Strauss, who is a senior lecturer in Chinese politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. For almost a decade, between 2002 and 2011, she was editor of the China Quarterly, and she has published extensively, not only on Chinese relationships with Latin America, but also Africa, as well as books about China per se. Ariel Armeni, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the center. Ariel is a former fellow here at the Wilson Center, is currently the director of the University of Miami Center for Latin American Studies. He is the Weeks Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of International Studies at the University of Miami's College of Arts and Sciences. He's published over the course of his relatively short career extensively on questions of democratization, civil society, human rights, as well as the role of China in Latin America. And we've also had the pleasure to collaborate on important publications here at the Wilson Center. Our third speaker, by way of commentary, will be Dr. Wei Hongxia, who is a visiting scholar. How did I do? We worked on that. I got some coaching before the event began. She's a visiting scholar at the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. policy towards East Asia and particularly U.S.-China relations and the multilateral architecture in East Asia. She is also a senior associate with the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, with whom we have had the pleasure of co-sponsoring events in the past. She is a prolific author and has her PhD from Nankai University. And then finally, we welcome again back to the center our colleague Mauricio Mesquita Morera from the Inter-American Development Bank, where he is the principal economist and research coordinator of the integration and trade sector. He has a PhD in economics from the University College London. Perhaps Julie and he can reminisce about their favorite pubs. And prior to joining the bank, Mauricio held positions in the research department at Brazil's development bank, known as BNDES, which is really, I think, the powerhouse in terms of lending to Latin America. Probably lends more, if I'm not mistaken, than the IDB and the World Bank combined. He's the lead author, in addition to focusing for many years on China, of the IDB's very important and path-breaking report on India, the next best thing for Latin America, which we also were pleased to discuss here at the Wilson Center several years ago. Without further ado, Julia.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank everyone for being here this relatively early hour and braving the public transport at peak rush hour in the morning, and to thank Ambassador Roy and particularly Cindy and her unbelievably wonderful staff for organizing this event at relatively short notice, particularly as it did involve a lot of coordination between the China Quarterly office, Cambridge University Press, here, Los Angeles, where I'm on leave, and of course Miami, and then bringing everyone together. What I will do is open with sort of general comments to establish the context and the evolution and the basic questions that have framed the book, and then we're going to turn over to Ariel, who will speak more definitively about some of the contents of the book. From the Great Wall to the New World is, at one and the same time, both a special issue of the China Quarterly. These happen once every 1 to 2 years through the China Quarterly, which I edited for 9 years. But per the agreement that the China Quarterly has with our publishers at Cambridge University Press, sometime later, usually 4 to 6 months later, the contents of the special issue are repackaged and reframed and have a nice cover put on it for becoming a standalone volume, in this case, From the Great Wall to the New World, China and Latin America in the 21st century. more typically a little bit later so it doesn't cut into the readership. But in this case, as well as for the case of an equally important volume, special issue that I did a couple of years ago on China and Africa, we wanted publication to be of the book, standalone book version, and the special issue through just the journal, to be available more or less simultaneously, because much of the audience for the topic would be non-traditional readers of the China Quarterly who wouldn't necessarily be coming across it. And we were very happy in being able to bring this out. The China Quarterly special issue and book was my last big project as editor for the China Quarterly, and we were delighted to be able to put this on. There was a context for both the intellectual content and the substantive content of this special issue and special publication. We had done a very, very successful version on special issue on China and Africa about 2 years before. And when we brought together everyone and had an amazing conference, the questions that kept coming up again and again and again in the context of China and Africa is, okay, how much of these special interactions, rhetoric, trade relations, patterns of migration, local tensions, mutual accommodation and misinformation and misperception, how much of what was going on with China and Africa relations were particular to China and Africa? How much of it was particular to China, i.e. did other relative newcomers and new investors in Africa experience more or less the same kinds of things? How much of this is simply contemporary globalization? How much of it is particular to China? How much of it was particular to Africa? And with the conclusion of the meeting on China and Africa about 2.5 years ago, it was agreed unanimously in the final rousing conclusion to the meeting that clearly the next step would be to basically repeat the same kinds of questions and the same kind of meeting for China and Latin America, a topic 2 or 3 years ago about which very little was done in a scholarly way. There were really only a handful of people, maybe 2 or 3 names of established scholars who were working in this area. And through this, very quickly, I learned that Ariel was the other main scholar who was working in this area. And so we began the collaboration to put together a meeting that was held at UCLA year before last, and then bring out this volume. And what we found, inevitably, was that some of the kinds of questions that animated the China-Africa volume animated the China-Latin America discussions as well, but clearly there were a lot of other things that were particular and relatively unique to China and Latin America, particularly in the realm of political economy. I have to say that it was a real challenge at the outset to come up with 9 or so articles that were really of very, very high scholarly quality. But we did manage. We got together a great group of people. And the actual results were very, very interesting. We ended up with, of course, a major focus on political economy. We have a wonderful essay on mining. We have a great one on trade. We have a very detailed one on Mexico and the auto parts industry. And of course, with this topic, China and Latin America, what everyone wants to know about is the political economy. Most of the work that had been done when we set out this project was done by economists on political economy issues, and we certainly included that, and we're happy to get more textured, rich descriptions than is often the case with the kind of work that trained economists do and are currently available in the public sphere. And we have some wonderful work on political economy. But we also were able to bring in people from very, very different disciplinary backgrounds. We have terrific anthropological work that compares migration and Chinatowns and the reactions of host local governments with Chinese migration and Chinatowns in Mexico and Cuba, for example. And we got a number of really very, very interesting articles about, for lack of a better term, a better way of putting it, perception and misperception. A number of our authors, more than we expected, wrote very, very interestingly about such questions as the way in which Cuba, if you can imagine this, the way that Cuba has ended up becoming a sort of political football within a Chinese elite intellectual discourse about what is and is not going right with the contemporary direction of reforms and opening up, with, broadly speaking, the new left in China arguing, holding up the example of Castro's Cuba, very far away and not all that much is known about it, to say, look, this is where everything has gone wrong with our reforms and at least implicitly what we need to be getting back to, whereas the more neoliberal strain of thinking within Chinese intellectual elite discourse holds Cuba up and socialism in Cuba up as a negative example of everything that we don't want to repeat and everything that we've moved beyond in various kinds of ways. Very, very interesting analysis that also brings in cultural politics and plays and huge online discourses about plays on Che Guevara and so forth and so on. We also have a very, very interesting essay on internet perceptions of Latin America, and from a more popular angle, mostly in all likelihood from a younger set of commentators, again with things you just wouldn't ever imagine. So we have perception, we have trade, we have migration, we have a really new set of essays moving beyond the more standard kinds of political economy that we've been used to in the past, as well as bringing in these questions of perception, politics, migration. And we think that this is a very, very interesting platform upon which to build for the future. When we began this work about a year and a half ago, we had no idea, even just 18 months ago, how quickly moving the field of China and Latin America would be. The primary sources that I looked at in terms of rhetoric and perception in Latin America towards China and in China towards Latin America at an elite and official level was one thing, but quite literally just in the last 6 or so months since the research was done, things have moved on, and as Cynthia just suggested, there's much greater nuance and much more pushback, crudely, in places like Peru, in terms of sensitivity to environment and mining companies and so forth and so on, whereas the previous government of Peru, for example, which I wrote on a little bit, really wasn't doing this at all. Whatever pushback was coming very much from mobilized local communities. And very interesting things are beginning to happen in Chile as well. So it is a rapidly, rapidly moving field, very much like globalization itself. We are very proud of this volume. We think it's a great set of first steps to illustrate the kind of work that can be done, and we are very, very much looking forward to having another generation of younger scholars with more time than we to get out into the field with the necessary languages to build on this and to push this work in all of its various ways forward. And for that, and that by way of general setup, I will turn over to Ariel. Oh, and I've just been reminded, we do have the volume that is available in paperback, and the way, if you're interested in procuring the volume after the event, the way to do so is to pick up the flyer that is available outside on the little bench where it says Cambridge at the top, and very prominently, 20% discount with this flyer. And the flyer will tell you everything that you need to know about being able to order direct from Cambridge University Press to get a 20% discount. It's available in paperback, but exchange rates being what they are, it is still on the high end of expensive for a paperback volume. And so the 20% discount might be very, very much appreciated. I do know that it is also available on Amazon.com, but without the 20% discount at this point in time.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by thanking Cindy Arnson, Director of the Latin American Program, and Ambassador Stapleton Roy, Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, for organizing this event. And I also want to give my special thanks to our commentators, Mauricio Mejita Moreira and Wen Hongxia, who I didn't know that you studied at Nankai University, where I spent a year as a Fulbright scholar. And so thank you very much for your generosity to participate in today's discussion. And it's really fascinating to see how scholars, practitioners, and organizations focus on different regions of the world are increasingly crossing boundaries to engage in new conversations. And I just wanted to mention, as Cindy said, that I was a fellow here at the Wilson Center, and you probably don't know the story. I don't know if you have heard that at the end of my term here, I decided to barricade in my office, and because I refused to leave the place because I was enjoying so much my experience here. But Cindy eventually convinced me, and I had to leave. So this is a fantastic place, and this is a place that it's a truly space for intellectual exchange. I have to say that one of the articles that I'm most proud of that I published was actually co-written with another fellow here, and it was born in the corridors, and this is what this place is. It's a place of conversation and exchange. So I am very, very grateful to be here again and for that experience. And I just wanted to mention very quickly before I start with my more formal remarks that outside on the table there is a little flyer, very environmentally conscious, about an electronic publication that the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Miami will make available for free next week, I believe, which is entitled Setting the Agenda, Asia and Latin America in the 21st Century. It's about 70 pages. And I think that it will be worth taking a look at it, because it gathered a very interesting group of scholars who were asked after a workshop that we held in Miami to talk about how we should frame an agenda of research for the future of these interactions. So I think that in that respect, it's a very interesting publication. When Julia and I envisioned the book, we had a primary objective to organize the volume in such a way that it would identify specific areas that could help to structure this new, empirically rich and rapidly changing field of study. The real challenge is to take a step back and think broadly and conceptually about how to conceive of the set of cross-cutting patterns that we are now beginning to see emerging in China and Latin America. Three key factors take preeminence in the study of China and Latin America, and more broadly, Asia-Latin America interactions. First, these interactions reflect a new reality. The center of gravity of the world economy is shifting toward emerging economies. From the perspective of Latin America, the relationship with China and the rest of Asia is key not only to understanding larger questions about globalization, but also the shift from north-south to south-south and possibly south-north power dynamics. Second, an agenda for the study of Asia's interactions with Latin America, particularly in the case of China, should move from quantifying to qualifying the relationship. we need to work toward a better understanding of matters such as the quality of trade and investment, which will require a comparative analysis while carefully exploring the density of relations at different levels, macro to micro, socioeconomic to cultural, and their multiple impacts from the environmental to the political. And third, studies should pay closer attention to the units of analysis, that is, the various actors in Asia-Latin America relations, of course including the state. To properly understand the complexity of interactions between the two regions, we must disaggregate both actors and processes. This demand poses a number of methodological and empirical challenges, particularly as we seek to understand global processes in key areas such as resource extraction. The diversity of the issues involved in this field of study brings with it a need to outline a clear research agenda with an initial focus on China-Latin America interactions. This is what we sought to do with our book. Our experience with this project and subsequent discussions allowed us to identify themes that offer significant potential for future research. So, Julia has talked about many of the subjects that were covered in the book, so rather than talking more specifically about the book, I will share with you a quick view of this panorama, which may be organized according to three distinct perspectives. First, we need studies that deepen our understanding of China's landing in Latin America and the Caribbean as part of China's broader going out in the developing world. Key to this effort is to learn more about China's own perceptions concerning its role in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's important to understand how Chinese actors conceive of their relationship with Latin America and their impact in the region, and to pay close attention to how China deals with its new geopolitical role in the Americas, how domestic factors in China influence its relationship with Latin America, and how perceptions about Latin America are changing in China. The study of China opens up wonderful opportunities to reflect upon Latin America. We need, in particular, analyses that examine what existing attitudes toward China reveal about the cultural and political complexities of Latin American societies. Limiting ourselves to saying that China has been the engager, lender, and initiator of relations is a perspective that affords Latin America little more than a passive and reactive role. It also overlooks the important fact that studying Latin American reactions to what China is and can be is a powerful tool for gaining insight into ideas and debates that inform the region's path to development and global insertion. As you can see from these remarks, that essentially this is challenging very much the way we approach area studies. For those interested in the study of U.S. relations with Latin America, several important opportunities exist. Specifically, new studies should closely follow the evolution of a possible U.S. strategy to engage Latin America via a Pacific initiative, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And these studies should take into account the new strategic alliances that define South-South coalition building and the evolving reform agenda being actively advanced by emerging powers. A second approach to developing a research agenda on Asia-Latin America involves opportunities for innovative comparative studies. While many topics are open to comparative analysis, particularly in the case of China's relations with Latin America, a few deserve special attention. We can organize this into three categories. First, the expansion of FTAs and regional and cross-regional integration agreements involving Latin America and Asia offers opportunities for detailed comparative analysis to examine, for example, the factors that motivate interregional and cross-regional integration, differences in bureaucratic processes and the role of interest groups, and their influence in domestic politics, and the use of integration language with regard to labor and environment, and of course, its implementation. Also, ample opportunities exist for new research on the topic of FDI. More analysis is necessary to help us understand how Chinese FDI differs from US and European FDI, and we are seeing now new and very valuable studies on this topic, or how it differs from Indian FDI in Latin America. We need to map the trajectory of FDI from its origin to its destination, while remaining mindful of the divergent roles of the actors involved, from national development commissions in China to civil society and local governments in Latin America. Likewise, it is important to examine the different strategies adopted by countries that have opened up their economies to Chinese FDI. And also, it is important to study the flow of people. The flow of people constitutes an interesting aspect of the relationship between Asia and Latin America and offers significant potential for more systematic research. Let me illustrate by referring to three potential avenues for research. Traders, workers, and managers form an important component of the links between China and Latin America. Potential avenues for comparison include analysis of Chinese workers in parts of Africa and the Caribbean. Similar opportunities for comparative research exist with regards to Chinese traders in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We need to develop a more complete understanding of how transnational networks are linked to local markets, the kinds of goods that are traded, and the various ways in which these businesses transgress formal rules, compete in different markets, and are regulated by governments. International migration is an important component of this phenomenon. There are significant opportunities for research on Asian diasporas in Latin America. Comparative studies of Asian organizations in Latin American countries can help us understand better the connection between transnational networks and development at the national and subnational level. And this is actually a topic that I'm starting to work on with the noted sociologist Alejandro Portes, an expert on migration. The growth and diversification of trade and social networks appears to be linked to a related increase in illicit activities with clear implications for research. Illicit networks are globalized and are comprised of a diverse set of activities ranging from trafficking drugs, arms, humans, and human organs to money laundering. Studies can explore comparatively different patterns of illicit networks, types of corruption, and state responses to illicit activities at the international, regional, and national levels. And finally, a third avenue for research on Asia-Latin America is to trace the components of various globalized processes, including mechanisms for resource acquisition, such as commodity trading, resource-backed infrastructure loans, business agreements, and joint ventures. This is perhaps the area that poses the greatest analytical challenges and also the largest potential for the creation of new knowledge. The resource extraction sector is a promising place to develop a research agenda. For instance, studies should look at the environmental impact of resource extraction, as well as the ways in which these activities relate to social conflicts involving indigenous communities and domestic opposition movements. Agricultural trade, of course, is another important theme. A focus on commodities such as soybeans and their derivative products can be very useful to deepen our understanding of political economy issues at the global and national level, sustainability issues, land concentration, technological diffusion, and a very, very fundamental topic, food security. So, we face several challenges when studying China-Latin America interactions. The speed of change, as Julia said, in the relationship is such that we tend to focus on the consequences without properly tracing the outcomes back to their roots. We also need to open our eyes to the diversity of actors that create China-Latin America interactions, not only governments and businesses, but also diasporas, news media, netizens, cultural expressions of various kinds, and others. As noted, it is also important to emphasize that the relationship is not simply about China's unidirectional expansion into Latin America, but also about the ways in which Latin America makes China view itself and rethink itself as an underdeveloped nation on a fast track to superpower status. So, to conclude, the three-pronged research agenda that I have outlined focuses on a deeper understanding of the elements that comprise Asia's and particularly China's relationship with Latin America. It calls for research that is analytically and empirically grounded. The contributors to our volume address this call, but of course, there is much more to be done. Our volume presents a compelling argument, I think, that China-Latin America interactions represent a field of inquiry that is beginning to take on a distinctive form, with the potential to generate different ways of thinking about contemporary processes of globalization. In this sense, our volume seeks to advance a broad research agenda, which we hope will contribute to configure a more integrated vision for the development of this thriving field of study. So thank you very, very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Cynthia. Congratulations first. Congratulations on the publishment of such a masterpiece. I also want to say thanks for Ambassador Roy to have me here to join the your institute event. I also very glad to see some friends, some old friends here. So I'm really happy, and it's a great pleasure and a tremendous honor to be here to speak on such a good book. I received this book yesterday, just before I decided what I should say today. So, thank you, Sandy. So I looked through the book while I cooked and at my dinner actually, and thinking about what kind of comments I should have. So for my knowledge, I think the contributors of this book, I also know a lot of colleagues who focus on China studies in China. I think contributors of this book has done much better job than Chinese academics. So as I noticed, those case studies and even a study on Chinese netizens' perception, it's very, very solid. So this reminds me to start with China's images of Latin America. That's how Chinese public's real image of Latin America. So for these years, you can read a lot of news coverage and academic articles by journalists who focus on Latin America reports and experts who focus on Latin America studies. So I think in those articles and news coverage, they have highlighted for rapid developments between of the relation between China and Latin America, such as the trade volumes have been expanded tremendously, the investment have been enlarged greatly, leadership show-ups have increased a lot. When I attended conferences in China on Latin American studies, I noticed at I think first few minutes they will highlight it such, we have on the trade volume has surged how much, and the investment has grown how much, and our leadership has how many visits to Latin American countries. They just summarize these things. So, but for Chinese public, the image of Latin America as a region did not change a lot actually. Two interesting examples here. In Mao Zedong era, when I was a little kid, my textbook always said when we learn geographical in our geography classes, the teacher always said Ya, Fei, La. Ya is Asia, Fei is Africa, La is Latin America. So Latin America as a region, due to the geographical distance and cultural differences, was always the last region to be mentioned, actually. Even now, in the textbook or in some publishment is the same. This kind of least attention has been cultivated in public's minds and even do not change today. People still think it's a distant continent and less relevant to China foreign affairs. People know very little about Latin America. There is a story in Tianjin Nankai University, the university I graduated from there. I actually, I got my master's degree, doctorate all there. I actually first want to be a student to focus on American studies. So I admire the United States because it's more developed. So, but unfortunately, my tutor cannot get any student who want to focus on Latin America. So finally, he came to ask me, would you like to be my student? And I said, okay. So, but finally, I shifted my study to American studies. In the university established a Center for Latin America in 1990s. For quite a few years, I think more than 5 years probably, the teachers in the center cannot get their meals. Why? Because the mail office thought Lamei Zhongxin, the center of Latin America, Chinese is Lamei Zhongxin, is a wrong name. Lamei, we have a economic center, we have a 美国中心 American center, but what's Lamei Zhongxin? What's Latin American center? So they think it's a wrong name. And then later, when they got to know it is a formal institution, they are so curious of what the name means. They asked my teacher, are you guys studying how to make the United States collapse? So, you know why? In Chinese, la is pull back. So Mei is an abbreviation of the United States Chinese name is 美国. So Lamei, they think, probably you want to pull back the United States. So it's very interesting. So another example, even now, is about the scholar's job. So people if you go public, if I told my friend, yes, I work with Latin American studies, and they will think, oh, you will make less money than those guys who focus on American studies. So, yeah. So why? The simple reason is the United States is the most prosperous country in the world, and the Latin American country, in their mind, most of them are very, very poor. So, it seems a little bit, yeah, silly assumption, but it's prevailing in today's China. Yeah. So that's why Sino-Latin American relations are not a hot topic in Chinese virtual community, as the book mentioned. So even Chinese media people, they cover less topics on Latin America than topics on the other regions. If you do a statistic on CCTV interviews, less Latin American people will be invited to there. But policymakers and the big companies have better knowledge of the distant continent, I think. But they don't, even they have better knowledge, but they don't see as many opportunities in this region as they see in other regions, just like Asia and Europe, let alone the United States. So among policy discussions in China policy circles and academic circles, Latin America still ranks in a backward place. Even when Latin America became a hot topic in recent years among international studies circle, challenges are always highlighted together with opportunities. So I remember at many conferences, we Latin American studies experts, they highlighted, we have a great achievements in development of Latin American relations with China, but we still have a lot of challenges. So every time they will talk about it, and even they blame that China has no overall and long-term strategy for Latin American policy. So I got to know that Latin American scholars now in China, they often got contracted with companies doing political and social stability assessment on Latin American countries. That means, I think, Chinese companies who want to invest in Latin America did not get enough confidence about the new continent for their business. So the overall knowledge of China about Latin American countries is in a lagged level, I think, actually today. This kind of images or cognition has resulted two situations. On the one hand, relevant policy divisions, departments, and companies are often to make a small achievement into a big one because they started from a very low level. So, for example, the trade volume, even the trade volume is, I think, compared with the United States, is very little. But they will highlight it, we have a big progress. That will give you an impression that China has achieved a lot with Latin American countries. So, for example, in China, at conferences, I noticed that when talking about the relations achievements in trade and investment, they always put some positive numbers, but what behind the numbers are less mentioned and disclosed. No solid assessments now on the result of the general volumes of investment. Actually, the ROI, that's the return the return of investment by Chinese company in Latin America is very, very low is comparing with American and Japanese companies' investment in Latin America. They are very, very low. So on the other hand, the the kind of images lack, in the other hand, lack of knowledge about Latin American countries has resulted a lot of blind investment and inefficient investment. Some companies are reported having great loss in Latin American investment, actually. So the last points I want to talk about is 走出去战略, is going out strategy. So going out strategy is was, I think, carried out. It started in late 1990s. In late 90s, this is, I think, initiated by FAGAIWI, its Development Informed Planning Commission. So the policy encourages companies to go abroad in an effort to promote trade and service in economic area and help to enhance political relations in political level. But in the context of such a strategy, China's companies' behavior in Latin America are always considered aligned with the central government's political goals. Yeah. So, but yeah, in my personal opinion, we cannot say companies' activities have nothing to do with the government policy, but I don't think they are always closely aligned together. So, you know, government and companies, they have different goals. The government, I think Chinese government, they always want to improve the images of China and want soft power, something like this. But the company, they have only one goal: profits. So even among administrative, that's sometimes the company's activities, they are not necessarily responsible for government images. So that's why some blame for human rights or labors happen. So, but even among administrative offices, there are different policy emphases. For example, Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Commerce, they have different emphases on policy. And also banks, the national banks, they give loans to Latin America. I don't think they are necessarily just has the same goal with Foreign Ministry. So that means coordination between ministries, the administrative departments have never achieved in China for Latin America policies. That's why, I'm sorry. That's why the final part of the China's 12 5-year plan is calling for enhanced cooperation. I'm not sure whether my translation is exactly, but they just want to enhance the coordination among ministries and companies operating in Latin America as well as in other regions. So, but even achieving level of coordination, it's a very big challenge for China in the coming year. You know, now China policymakers, policy research circles, and companies have realized that the ways to engage Latin America. The ways to engage Latin America should be adjusted. So, Julia, you, I'm sorry, you just put a question about how quickly the engagement of China with Latin America would be in the future. So, I personally am not so optimistic about it, but about a quick engagement in the near future. Why? 3 reasons. One is, I'm sorry, I don't know what. One is China will focus on domestic adjustment in the near future, in the next few years. Second, that's what I just said. China government and companies will do some adjustment in ways engage Latin America. So the adjustment is not so easily finished, I think, achieved in a few months, a few years. So third, we engage in Latin America. There's also an inevitable factor for China to consider. That is the interest of the United States. While expanding economic cooperation and deepening political relations with Latin American countries, China policy research circles recognize that the U.S. enjoy greater strategic advantages in the region. China, I think, policy research circles, they agree that the United States has a lot of advantages in this region, and they always say this is the backyard, 后院. Yeah. So China, but for the relations, so when we talk about the China relations with Latin America, we cannot avoid mentioning the relations with the United States. Some scholars put it in the triangle relations. I think a few other people don't agree with this. And also, I think Chinese government would rather to put its relations with Latin America bilaterally, not multilaterally, not trilaterally. So they think that will make, if put the relations into a triangle one, this will make the relations more complicated. Bilateral relations between China and United States are now have been already so complicated. Is that right, Ambassador? Yeah. So they don't want to make it more complicated, the triangle ones. So Latin America is a region of varieties. China's engagement with the region is not simply companies, trade, investment, and the guideline of the government. So there are also various choices, and there are also various choices and interests inside China. I mean, different departments, different sectors, they have different requirements, they have different interests. So I hope we can look into China-Latin America relations more objectively and more detailedly. Just like Dr. Armani just said, we still have a great potential to do research on Latin America, on relations between China and Latin America. So this book is very good research, simple. So I will recommend it to my Chinese colleague when I'm back to China. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Well, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity to be here. Let me just begin by saying that I very much enjoy reading the volume, the papers. I think they clearly cover a very wide range of issues, and particularly they cover issues that haven't been covered before, and it clearly go on uncharted waters. I'm particularly impressed by the papers on Chinese diaspora, the paper on Chinese views on Cuba, and Ariel's paper on lax perception of China as revealed by newspaper coverage. Not that the other papers are not good. It's just that those, I think, they go where nobody has been before, and by doing that, they clearly help us understand better the relationship. But coming to my job as a discussant, I think the fact that the book covers, or the volume covers, so many issues has clearly pros and cons. I mean, the pros is that it forced me to go beyond, the stuff I usually read. And the cons is that, it's very hard for me, particularly, very hard for a narrow-minded economist like me, and according to some, a neoliberal economist, which is even worse, to try to give some relevant comments to issues that are related to international relations, sociology, or even anthropology. So I really had this struggle about what really to comment, and then I decided to cherry pick. I'm sorry. So, and sort of focus on the issues that I think I'm less ignorant about, and one issue which I think it's important for me as a practitioner. My job in the IDB is a job that is focused on policy recommendations. And I think this is the weakest parts of most of the papers. And when you look at policy recommendations, I think that not necessarily that I disagree with the policy recommendations, but I think they lack on specifics, which is, it's not something that I think it's specific to those papers. I think it's a common problem with scholarly papers in general, including mine. I mean, we spend, 20 pages with this wonderful diagnostics, running regressions and stuff like that. And then we end up with a paragraph about policy recommendations, which usually don't have too much of the specifics. So I'm going to pick on these issues, and I'm trying to concentrate on three sort of papers / issues, which is Brazil, of course, because I'm Brazilian, and I know a little bit about Brazil, and the papers of Jenkins and Barbosa, and a little bit of Julia in terms of her views about Brazil and China relationship. Then I will just comment on Enrique's papers on Mexico, and finally on Peru's, the paper on mining in Peru, which I think it's helpful in terms of bringing up what are the main issues and to compare different responses across the region to the Chinese challenges. So beginning with Brazil, Jenkins and Barbosa has this very good analysis of what is the impact on the manufacturing in Brazil. So they have a lot of data, and it's typical a good paper on the impact. But when it comes to to the policy recommendations, they argue, well, Brazil should avoid protection, but then Brazil should use, using their words, the appropriate policies and institutions, and bet on regional integration schemes, which I think it's hard to disagree with that, but it doesn't take us that far in terms of try to formulate what would be the best response for Brazil. And I'm particularly worried about Brazil because when you look at across the region, I think Brazil had one of the most troubling, I would say, trying to look for the best adjective to that. But when you look at what happens, how Brazil responded, since the early 2000s and today, how this response evolved, I don't think it's the right response. They started with a very naive view of the relationship. I think they believe in their own rhetoric, and believe on the Chinese rhetoric as well. I think Julia talks a lot about that. This idea that we are all brothers, South-South, and we all have this common interest. And then they negotiate the market economy status without getting too. I mean, they didn't get anything really in return. And then they realized that there was some conflicting issues out there. I mean, the manufacturing sectors were competing. The manufacturing sector in Brazil was hurting by Chinese competition. And then they sort of tried to backtrack on some of the decisions they made and tried to change the approach, which was something that was welcome. I mean, a more realistic view of the relationship, and then based on interests, of both sides. But then they went all the way to another type of response, which is I'm trying to be brief here, but they try to use this strategy on one hand of tit for tat. I mean, the Chinese are promoting the industries, subsidizing, they're using the exchange rate to promote the exports. So let's do the same thing. And this has also to do with what type of influence the Chinese economic success has on the political and the policy, economic policy debate in Brazil. So Brazil, started to, step up all those industrial policy measures. And worse than that, Brazil started to use its trade policy, to try to respond to the Chinese challenges, but not to focus specifically on China, which I think, there's a lot of good reasons to be worried about the way Chinese companies compete. But they went well beyond that and started to contaminate the whole trade policy. They raised tariffs across the board for all countries and started to use, all kinds of local content rules. And so they are clearly pushing in this direction. And also, I think it not only it's, we've been there before in the 60s and the 70s. We know that, this doesn't work that well, at least doesn't work as well as it works in Asia, and it has to, also I think also misses the big picture because they still obsessed about this idea that manufacturing is the only way to go, and the world has changed radically in the last 20 years, in great part because of China. But not only China. I mean, the manufacturing market became very, very congested. I mean, you can, think that you can, work your way to a developed status by just exporting manufacturing these days. I mean, if you look at what the prices, the behavior of manufacturing prices these days, they are the commodities of the 60s and the 50s. So, I think it lacks this long-term view that, with China, India, all the other developing countries that industrialize, that are exporting manufacturing, perhaps it's not the best strategy to try to insist in manufacturing, particularly try to insist with the same kind of policies that brought a lot of trouble for us in the 60s, 70s, and end up leading to the lost decades that we had in the 80s and the 90s. So I had the impression, it's not explicit in Julia's paper, but I thought she was a little bit enthusiastic about Brazil's response. So I would like to hear, it would be nice if she could clarify exactly what she thinks it's good about the way Brazil is dealing with China. On Mexico, I mean, Dussel Peters has this, again, very nice analysis about the auto parts and the car industry in Mexico, in China, data, the usually good analysis. But then when it comes to, to the policy recommendations, he has this idea that, he acknowledged that there are conflict of interests, conflicting interests between manufacturing sector in both countries, which is obviously, you just have to look at what happened to Mexico's share in the U.S. market. But then he comes up with this idea that countries could cooperate, and then somehow you could push Chinese and Mexican companies to develop some sort of cooperation, which I think it's not very how do I put that? I mean, not very promising, because these are commercial interests. I mean, governments are not going to force companies to go into joint ventures. I think that the incentives, the market incentives, have to be set in a way that would provide for these things to happen, which I think is the same sort of issue that comes up in Mercosur in Brazil as well, and comes up in Jenkins' paper about Brazil, about this regional integration scheme. Mercosur there's always this talk that somehow there's going to be a value chain of manufacturing goods between Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and somehow the governments can produce that kind of thing by decree. I don't think this is going to happen. Neither in Mercosur, not between Chinese companies and Mexican companies in auto parts or any other industry. I do think that the Chinese eventually are going to invest more in Mexico for good business reasons, because they're going to be close to one of its biggest markets, and also for political economy reasons. I mean, if you look at the size of the trade deficit that China has with Mexico, it's $50 billion. It's better to be worried about the type of reactions you're going to get from politicians. So it's better to try to think of the Japanese strategy in terms of transplants. Try to shift a little bit the weight from trade and move it to investment. But in concluding with Mexico, I think that the contrast with Mexico's response to China, if you compare with Brazil, it's stark. Mexico, despite the fact that it was the country that was most affected by Chinese competition in manufacturing, they didn't panic, and they didn't go into the old type of industrial policies that they had in the past. And amazingly enough, if you look at the figures of the last 2 to 3 years, Mexico started to recover some of its market share that it had in the U.S. It was going down, and then since the crisis, it's going up. And basically because Mexico has a huge advantage in terms of proximity. And if you look at the goods that managed to gain ground in the U.S. markets, are those heavy, quote-unquote, goods that cost a lot to transport, or goods that are time-sensitive, that it's important to be close to the client. So they're doing a much better job, I think, in terms of reacting to the challenge than Brazil has been doing. And finally, on the issue of Peru, again, I think it's a very interesting paper, very well documented, very good analysis. It confirms some of the other analysis that we see, not only in mining, but for instance, Kevin Gallagher's papers on Chinese banks. They all come to the same conclusion, that the Chinese are after their business interests, not necessarily some sort of a strategic or ideological motivation behind that. But, again, in the end, when it comes to the policy recommendation, in just one paragraph, he says, well, it's not enough just to have a good business environment to get the most out of the Chinese investment. You need to have government planning, integrated industrial policy, a good relationship between society and the government, which are too broad, and some worry. I'm not sure why integrated industrial policy would help in this case. I do think what would help is a good regulatory framework, which is, goes without saying. And if you don't have a good regulatory framework, you're going to get in trouble not only with the Chinese, but with any other, foreign investor. But in the case of the Chinese, it's particularly important because even though we can, come to the conclusion that, they really seems to be after the business interest, there's the governance of those companies are very poor. I mean, particularly in terms of transparency. So you do need to be worried about, particularly if you're talking in the mining case of state companies. Now they might be, focused on their business interests, but if you don't have enough transparency and good governance in those companies, those business interests can lead to bad results for those countries involved. So I think I already talked enough. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks to all the panelists for wonderful presentations. We're open for questions and comments. Please wait for the microphone and do us all the courtesy of introducing yourself, your name, your institution. That'd be great. It's all been said, right? Chris Wilson there in the back.
Hi, I'm Chris Wilson with the Mexico Institute. I guess my question is mostly for Mauricio, but anyone else who'd like to take a swing at it as well. I wonder if you could comment, especially on the currency issue, and this might be a case where there really is a bit of a triangle going on with Brazil in particular, the U.S. and China. Brazil's attacked the U.S.'s quantitative easing recently. I'm just wondering how this all sort of plays in, if you have any analysis of Chinese, there's belief that China may be manipulating its currency, and how that relates to competitiveness in this sort of triangular fashion.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a couple of questions if there's other hands here up front. Here we go, all the way down. Down here.
Hello, Peter Knight, Telematica, Rio de Janeiro. What really impressed me about most of the presentations by the commentators was something that Graham Allison put into his dissertation. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And I was wondering if, the bottom line I heard is everybody's representing their interests, the corporate nature of Chinese ministries as well as many others, but I think it's particularly pronounced in China. I used to involve teaching in macroeconomics, and we found there were 5 universities that fed only the finance ministry, and to get the Commission on Economic Reform or the central bank to, which are very important in macro policy, to even pay any attention or interact, it seems that it only happened at the state council level. So I think maybe these bureaucratic pillars are even more important in China than some other countries. They're certainly important here, though, too. So I wonder if you just be the counter attack is, why isn't this? Do any of you believe that this isn't the fundamental factor driving, interest, bureaucratic and economic interest driving it rather than strategic and geopolitical interests in the relationship?
If not, I actually have a question. Thanks, Peter. Which is that a lot of the discussion now has focused on political economy, precisely the issues that you say have dominated and that are not the only ones to study. And I was wondering whether Ariel and Julia could talk a little bit more about not just the new research agenda and the need for a deepening understanding, but what you have seen in the many years that you have focused on this, both as a scholar of China and a scholar of Latin America, that you see as very important and new aspects of the dynamic that you'd like to expand on a little bit. So why don't we start in reverse order. Mauricio, if you want to begin with either the question that Peter raised or the question that Chris raised.
All right, the exchange rate issue. I think it's another good example of how Brazil responded to this challenge. I mean, instead of trying to raise those troubling issues involved in the competition with China, the exchange rate, all the industrial policy, all the subsidies involved, Brazil decided to, do the same thing, as much as they can do, and try to avoid as much as possible to confront China. And that's something that I find it hard to understand. I mean, Brazil, it's not shy of confronting the U.S., taking the U.S. to the WTO, all the cotton cases and things. I mean, they're still friends. I mean, good, partners. So why can't we do the same with the Chinese? And clearly, in the case of the exchange rate, they finally raised the issue. But when they raised the issue, they put the U.S. together, which I don't think makes any analytical sense. I mean, one thing is to target the exchange rate for commercial purposes. The other thing is to try to react to a crisis and try to get out of a recession with monetary policy. So, but again, they put those two issues together. And the fact that they are, trying to, this tit for tat strategy undermines their complaints. I mean, how can you take take Chinese to the WTO if they are also doing the same kind of things at home? I mean, raising tariffs, subsidizing, and in the end, Brazil is going to be, in a weaker position because you can compete with the amount of reserves that the Chinese have, of the size of the state that they have. So if competitions are going to be based on industrial policy, I mean, I'm sure that not only Brazil but the whole Latin America is going to be in trouble. On the issue of business versus geopolitical interest, I think, I think in general, my impression is that business interests have prevailed on the whole, and the type of business and investments or deals that China has with Latin America. But there's always this, sort of shadow, because you're not sure who you are dealing with, and if it's particularly if they're explicitly state companies, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. It might be commercial interest today, but not. So I think it would be very helpful if the Chinese move towards improve the governance of those companies and to try to privatize them as much as possible. Would make the relationship much easier.
I answered the question of the why they have what kind of interests between China and the U.S., China and Latin American countries, they develop their relations. I think we can find 4 points here. Between China and the Latin American countries, there are no any disputes in history. It's easier for them to engage with each other. So the second is both sides, they have similar requirements to develop their economy. Yeah, I just read that Argentina has made a 2020 development plan. So it's similar to Chinese, the 5-year plan, something like this. They have even we can find a lot of similarities in pursuit of development. So the third is they find they have some complementary sectors for trade. Yeah. The fourth is China has less requirements and disciplines for Latin America countries when they give them loans or investments. So I don't know what is the Latin America embassies doing here. Well, but I know in China, Latin American embassies has done a very good job in public diplomacy. And they are keen to attend various conferences related to Latin America, related to their countries. They are very easy to be invited to present the conference. And also those embassies, they welcome Chinese people, Chinese scholars to join the activities, something like this. So I think probably because the culture are so different, they are curious about each other. So that's...
The question of, ultimately, is this just about interests and where you stand depends on where you sit? Well, the short answer is, of course. Why would China and Latin America be any different than any other area of inquiry? But when you think about it, interests is sort of a cover for almost everything. There are material interests, there are bureaucratic interests, and there are symbolic interests. And what we tried to do in the volume is to get beyond very narrow definitions of material interests. Obviously, we dealt with that as well in a number of the papers in terms of the political economy. But beginning to cope with this larger question of bureaucratic and power interests and how they intersect, really on both sides, both the Latin America side and the China side, with material and business interests. And then this larger question of how you sell it to your publics in terms of symbolic posturing. Policies, crudely, need to be sold. You need to convince people that a particular set of policies, whether it's FTA or anything else, is going to be in their interest. And this operates at many different levels. It's symbolic, it's general, it needs to be material, obviously. It helps greatly if it's bureaucratic. And this gets very, very tricky because, of course, China is not one thing any more than Latin America is one thing, but it is a unitary state with a history of representing itself very strongly as a black box sovereign state that is one thing. And the historical merging in the People's Republic of China between big business interests and the state makes this credible. Now, in fact, there are enormous differences between big conglomerates and big industry in China and the public face of the state through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example. In fact, the big business interests are bureaucratically so powerful that whenever these deals are being made, the people at the table that have to represent this stuff publicly, i.e. the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they're the least important people at the table domestically, almost without question. And you have to sort of feel sorry for the public face of Chinese diplomacy because they have to run around sweeping up the messes that happen because of poor governance, lack of transparency, and the unarticulated closeness or lack thereof between the private or privatized business profit-seeking interests of Chinese companies going out and acting abroad versus the more public face of diplomacy. So, of course, where you stand depends on where you sit. On the whole, there seems to be more transparency about the bureaucratic interests and the public interests and the rhetoric and so forth in Latin America than there is in China, because in the vast majority of Latin American countries, there are relatively open to very open presses. There are regular elections. There's noisy civil society and public space in a way, and fora for the articulation of conflict and so forth, in a way that this is much, much more muted in China. The Chinese official sphere has captured discourse and continues to dominate discourse in China in a way that that is not the case with most Latin American governments. Now, with what I looked at, i.e. the articulation of public discourse, official public discourse between China and Latin America, one sees very, very different examples of how this works out in particular bilateral relationships. China's official rhetoric on win-win, everybody taking part in an international division of labor, and everybody does better because of comparative advantage. This is a relatively new discourse in China. It's about 20 years old. They've totally gone over to it. The official going out policy has adopted this hook, line, and sinker. And what one sees in particular bilateral relations is that this discourse that the Chinese official sphere propagates is either almost perfectly mirrored back, as in the case of Peru and Chile until very, very recently, literally the last 6 months for Peru, and much, much less so in the case of Brazil. So I wasn't talking about industrial policy. I know my limitations, and I wouldn't ever dare to go there, but rather the difference not between Brazil and an ideal world of what Brazil should or shouldn't do, but Brazil in a real context of its neighbors and other countries in Latin America whose top political elites have gone for a discourse of perfectly mirroring back this discourse, which is really very, very problematic. Sure, it's win-win, but who wins? Who gets privileged? Until very recently, a succession of Peruvian governments didn't want to ask those questions. They didn't want to know. They didn't care there were all these disturbances off in the mountains with all of those poor people. The metropole didn't want to know. Whereas in Brazil, there was a much quicker set of responses and pushback compared to, say, either Chile, where political elites had completely gone over to neoliberal discourses for their own domestic reasons, as well as Peru. So that was the comparison. Much more pushback, much more articulation. And China treats Brazil differently because of its scale. And so you see this mirrored in the beginnings of change of the discourse in China itself. It's still at a very early stage, but maybe we'd really better go beyond this narrow conception of win-win. Maybe we really do have to think of real, meaningful, equal partnership. There's this rhetoric about equal partnership. As near as I can tell, in Latin America, Brazil is the only place where this is getting any traction at all. It's even being discussed in terms of actual policy specifics. Why that is, I'm not sure, but I suspect it has something to do with scale. So, to the larger question of win-win, well, of course it's about where you sit. But this relationship is so multidimensional, and still the two sides know so little about each other. And there's such a rapidly moving rate of change, particularly in terms of business deals, trade, and so forth and so on, that things still haven't congealed in terms of where policymakers see their interests in some combination of material, bureaucratic, and symbolic. And so I think it would be very interesting to continue to look at this question of how the discourse shakes out and where people, genuinely important political and economic actors, begin to see their interests playing out and acting out. I think it's still very, very much a work in progress, and it's not at all fixed, either on the China side or the Latin America side.
Right. I just would comment that I find it incredibly curious to see this sort of win-win concept coming out of China when this has been sort of a dominant part of of Western economic thought since the 18th and 19th century, if not earlier, and Latin America especially had thoroughly debunked it, and now, as you say, has come back as a way, as seeing these kinds of commodities as tremendous engines of growth.
We have a few minutes left, and so what I want to do is to combine a short response to the comments by the commentators, and then to address Cindy's question. I'm going to try to be a little bit provocative here. Which I always enjoy.
This is not something for which you are not.
Yeah, I know. So I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, and we could say we present a book on new research on China, Latin America, and so a commentator from China says it's not a big deal, actually, particularly for China. And you're talking about, a future where growth will continue, etc. I don't think that that's going to really happen. China is shifting its attention to other things, and so, I don't think this is such a big deal. And it's interesting because something that is discussed in the book, and we have one contributor here, Gonzalo Paz, and this is something that came up in recent meetings that we have, is of course, the case of Japan. And is this, deja vu all over again, and so is this Japan. So that's one thing. Then the other commentator from a policy point of view says, when I read this material in terms of policy contributions, I don't see anything new. I don't think. So it's I know that I'm pushing things a little bit, but, you hear that and you say, well, this is pretty depressing. What am I doing? So, but I think it is not. I think that actually these are very, very interesting comments if we look at them in a broader context, and very much Cindy helped us with her question. There, and there is no time to go in detail, but there are very interesting things going on in China that have to do with Latin America. Maybe those are not really should be not measured in terms of volume, but more in their importance or the quality. First, it's very interesting, and as I said, I spent a year at Nankai University, where they have a center for Latin American studies, and yes, there is it's very interesting because I think that even though in China we have seen a very important development in the training of experts, Chinese experts on Latin America, the still basic understanding of China in Latin America, I think, is much more developed than what we see otherwise from China to Latin America. When probably in China they have more resources to support that. But we see that there are very interesting discussions going on in China. Julie and I are writing an article on the concept of La Meihua, the idea of Latin Americanization, and how Chinese scholars are looking at this concept and are saying, what is their conception of Latin Americanization, and what is that we need to do in order to avoid the negative connotations and implications of Latin Americanization. There are very interesting new developments that are being studied by anthropologists who are looking at new patterns of consumption of Latin American cultural and other goods by the very wealthy. in China. This is very, very new research that is going on right now. I'm writing an article with a Chinese colleague from the ILAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, San Hongbo, on energy security. And it's very interesting because in the big picture, Latin America is not the main source of energy for for China. But in China, there are serious discussions about the future. That is, about how to look, because China, as you know, has a policy of diversifying their sources of energy. And so there are very interesting discussions about that. And finally, and this takes me to talk about the policy recommendations and the question that Cindy raised, is that we are at a point in which what we need, and that's one thing that we try to do with this book, are systematic studies that, for example, to begin with, do real empirical analysis, rather than having sort of very macro studies and having these studies that basically are not based on solid empirical research. And that was probably the most important objective of this book. Now, the book makes, particularly in the introduction, some conceptual propositions, but here is where there is a tremendous, I think, possibility for advance. To begin with, we talk about in China and in Latin America about concepts, and really no one knows what we are talking about. I'll give you one example: strategic partnership. China says that it has a strategic partnership with Brazil. The Brazilians don't really know what strategic partnership is, and the Chinese kind of don't explain, and we don't really know if they know what strategic partnership is. And for us social scientists, this is a great opportunity, because this is an opportunity not to invent what it is, but to look at the reality of what is there in a multidimensional way and try to understand these kinds of concepts. And yes, in terms of policy recommendations, and I'm not justifying, I agree 100% with Mauricio, but I think that this is an area where, particularly on the part of Latin America, yes, there is a lot to be done. And we are here at the Wilson Center, where the great idea is to integrate scholarly work and policy work. But it is important to say that the objective of the book was not to provide policy lessons, because we couldn't do everything. That is, it was important, as I said, to generate these studies that look at specific issues empirically. Mauricio mentioned my chapter, which looks systematically at the case of Colombia and compares the two major newspapers in Colombia, which have different political, ideological orientations, and looks systematically at how they conceive and make the image of China. And really, there are no studies like that. And when I presented this at a big conference in Mexico on China, Latin America, many people from around the region got very excited about just taking the chapter, use the model, and go and study the same thing in various Latin American countries, because we want to know. We want to know, beyond public opinion surveys, what kind of image we see that is being developed in Latin America about China. Finally, there are some, I think, promising areas that are very important, particularly from the point of view of Latin America. We have, and we are having, a big discussion about models of development, and this is coming back. And this involves so many dimensions, from, of course, the role of commodities and the role of trade, to the architecture of global finance and aid, which the presence of China has generated a lot of debate on that. And also fascinating new work that is being done on IPR, on intellectual property rights, and the implications and the lessons maybe that Latin America can draw from the way in which China deals with IPR, which I have to say that, of course, immediately, we say they violate, all regulations, etc. Well, there is much more to see there. That is, again, we lack serious studies that look at these elements in detail, and we cannot just leave these for the pundits, for the commentators. That is, this is what we need, at least as scholars. Then there is a very important rearrangement of the Latin American region, and this rearrangement in the way that blocks are being constructed, and certain countries are taking different positions in the hemisphere, but particularly in their global insertion, is very important. It's changing, and it's not defined only by the relationship with the United States, which used to be, of course, the predominant one. And the Asia axis is, of course, extremely important. And so I don't have time to talk about that, but you know that the countries in the Alianza para el Pacífico and what Brazil is doing, and we are seeing a reaccommodation, or however we say, of the region that I think is very important to understand. And finally, I think that it is important to say that around the world, what I see is that scholars focus not only in Latin America, but on, let's say, the developing world or the emerging economies, are very concerned about the fact that the language that we have to describe the new shifts in the world is not good. That is, we don't like anymore South-South. I use it, but we don't like it. It doesn't really tell what we need to tell. And so I think that in this sense, it's very interesting because we are, and this is something that China poses for us, Latin Americanists. I mean, the need to be thinking about new language and new ways to conceptualize what's going on. And finally, for Latin America, and this needs to be, always we forget about this and needs to be mentioned, is that while the relationship with China is very important in terms of the global architecture of power, and there are very interesting alliances developing there, we need to remember too that we are talking about a country with a political regime that is different from the political regime predominant in Latin America, democracy. And I think that there is a lot to be studied about the new presence of China in Latin America and in the world, and how this is changing the way in which we look at democracy, the way in which democracy has legitimacy, etc., particularly at a time in which the United States is having very serious problems to use the language of democracy, as the way to connect to Latin America, which we used to be, as we know, the way some decades ago. I'll leave it here.
We're out of time. Please join me in thanking our co-authors. Very good.
You did.
Thank you.
You did great. That was fun.
I'm sorry, probably my language.
没事没事。
I will send you my
你有名片？名片？因为我没有，因为我今年就是学这样，
学的非常好。
好几年这样子，好几年这样子。
在